We're continuing our study of the book of Revelation on our program today. We're trying to understand its message for us today without misusing the book or misapplying it to some future political ruler or events. So I hope that you'll stay with us as we study.
The good news was written and the full truth revealed, that the church might be whole and Christ's fullness made real. Our Lord in His wisdom gave men gifts from above. The Spirit then taught them the truth in love.
Welcome to The Truth in Love. And now your host, Dave Miller.
The book of Revelation is certainly an incredible book, fascinating, interesting. Of course, all of the Bible is, but Revelation holds special meaning to people because of its unusual means of communication, using apocalyptic language. In our last program, we were working our way chapter by chapter through the book with a view toward understanding the basic action of each one of those chapters. We did the first 11 chapters, which is the first half of the book exactly. Then we moved into chapter 12 to commence the last half of the book. We saw in chapter 12 this seven-headed, fierce, awesome, blood-red in color dragon. And we don't have to speculate about the proper interpretation of that apocalyptic symbol. We are informed in the chapter that represents Satan. We talked about how he was hovering before a woman who was about to give birth to the Christ child. I believe the woman represents Old Testament Israel. That was the Old Testament prophets speak of Israel being the bride of God, God's wife, and together they produced a child, which was Jesus. And the bride of Jesus is the church in the New Testament. Jesus is the bridegroom. So there's the imagery that carries forth in the Old Testament and on into the New. So in chapter 12, Satan is represented as the instigator. That's the central concept of this chapter. Satan is the instigator of the persecutions and the mistreatments that are being inflicted against first century Christians and the Church of Christ. That brings us to chapter 13. We're introduced to two beasts in this chapter. The first 7 or 8 verses, we are introduced to a seven-headed sea beast. He comes up out of the ocean. He steps up onto the seashore. Each one of his 7 heads are lion heads, lion mouths. He has the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, an incredible creature. Once again, since chapter 1 tells us this book is not to be taken literally, it's figurative. We know there's no such creature, never will be. It's simply imagery to represent a certain individual or force or power in the first century, clearly Caesar Domitian, who implemented worship of himself and implemented that throughout the empire. Then you look at the last half of chapter 13, a second beast, this one called a land beast, also called the false prophet elsewhere in the book. This beast has 2 horns and looks like a lamb, but you know when he opens his mouth and speaks? It is the voice of Satan. It is the voice of the dragon of chapter 12. Here are these 2 political adversaries, these 2 henchmen of Satan that he could use in the first century to wreak havoc against the cause of Christ and the Church of Christ in the first century. The Caesar and the official governing body that instigated worship of the emperor. These are the 2 henchmen, the 2 forces that Satan uses in his assault and attack upon the church toward the end of the first century A.D. That brings us then to chapter 14. Do you know the Bible teaches that every time Satan has had his Goliath, God has had his David. Every time Satan has had his Ahab and Jezebel, God has had his Elijah. So God always meets and adequately faces and overcomes any evil force that Satan might throw at the people of God. So in chapter 14, to offset the influence of these evil beasts of chapter 13, we are presented with God's allies in this political and social circumstance that Christians were facing in the last decade of the first century. Notice how these allies are presented. First, we are shown the Lamb standing on Mount Zion with 144,000 redeemed. What a comforting picture. What a portrait that must have given great hope to those persecuted Christians in the first century. To see Jesus, to see 144,000 of the redeemed, they're well in control. That would allow Christians to feel that ultimately there's nothing for us to fear in this life, no matter how difficult political and social circumstances may become. As you read down through that chapter, we see the everlasting gospel. That is ultimately the tool that God uses to advance His will on this planet. The gospel. The gospel is God's power to save people, Romans 1:16. You keep reading on down in that chapter, and we see the Son of Man sitting on a throne, and He has in His hand a sickle. You know, sickles in apocalyptic language refer to judgment, because that's what a sickle does. When you use a sickle to harvest something, you're ending life. You're cutting off the life of that plant. So sickles in apocalyptic imagery represent judgment. Here is a sickle of judgment with the Son of Man wielding this sickle. And notice whenever there is some harvesting that occurs toward the end of the chapter, that which is harvested, the fruit, the grapes, are thrown into a wine press. Well, Middle Eastern people are familiar with wine presses, where grapes are squeezed in order to render the juice. But this is called the great wine press of God's wrath. And out of the spigot comes not grape juice, but blood that is lengthy. It produces a river 120 miles long. That's given literalist interpreters difficulty. There's not enough room in Palestine for that length of a river. It's deep enough to touch the bridles of the horses. A lot of blood. Obviously not literal. Highly exaggerated, figurative, apocalyptic language to convey the idea that Jesus in due time will take vengeance on the oppressors of His people. So that is chapter 14. God's allies. That brings us to chapter 15, where we are introduced to 7 angels who are given 7 bowls. These 7 angels have the 7 last plagues. The text says, "For in them the wrath of God is complete." That is, now we're going to see God's wrath unleashed. These 7 angels are given 7 bowls. The bowls are said to be full of the wrath of the God who lives forever and ever. Now notice the imagery that we've had up to this point. Chapter 6, 7 seals. What do seals do? Seals disclose. They uncover information. Then that gave way to 7 trumpets. What do trumpets do? Trumpets trumpet. They sound. They warn. Do you know that was the purpose of those 7 trumpets? To warn men to repent of the atrocities that they were inflicting against God's people at that point in history. Now we come to 7 bowls. What do bowls do? What are they meant to do? Bowls are meant to be emptied. These bowls are full of the wrath of God. They are about to be emptied. They are about to be poured out upon the oppressors of God's people. We move into chapter 17, or rather chapter 16, and sure enough, these bowls are poured out, all 7 of them. You know, earlier when we had those series of 7, you'd have 6 and then a segue or pause and then the 7th. Not this time. All 7 bowls poured out in chapter 16. So the point of chapter 16, God's wrath is unleashed, finally and ultimately against these opponents and oppressors of God's people, the evil Roman Empire that was persecuting the Church of Christ toward the end of the first century. That brings us to chapter 17 and chapter 18. And if we were to summarize these 2 chapters very quickly, the essence of these 2 chapters is we are seeing the results of the pouring out of the bowls of wrath in chapter 16. Here's the aftermath. And as you read through those chapters, it is a terrible aftermath. Rome is represented under the apocalyptic figure Babylon. The religious life comes to an end in the empire as a result of these bowls of wrath being poured out. Chapter 18, commercial life comes to an end. All of these great commercial businessmen throughout the world of that day that benefited from Rome meet with disaster because this great commercial enterprise, this great commercial empire has been devastated. Social life comes to an end, which includes, merrymaking like weddings and parties and so forth. All of this graphically described in chapter 18 and 19, the aftermath of God pouring out His wrath upon these enemies and opponents of His people. That brings us then to chapter 19. Now, the action of the book is coming to a climax. We are seeing the outcome of God taking vengeance against His people, and the ultimate one who is in a position to rescue His people and to see them through this terrible adversity is this wonderful warrior who is seated upon a white stallion. He is at the head of the mounted cavalry of heaven. He comes out of heaven itself. He has a sharp two-edged sword coming out of His mouth. That's reminiscent of chapter 1, the Son of Man. His robe that He's wearing has been dipped in blood. He has 3 designations: faithful and true, the Word of God, King of kings and Lord of lords. This is clearly apocalyptic imagery to symbolize Jesus, who is well able to harness the forces of nature, the forces of human existence in time, in history, in order to champion the cause for His people and to put them beyond the oppressions of the oppressor, and to inflict vengeance, retribution, and punishment against those who were opposing His cause toward the end of the 1st century and perhaps the early part of the 2nd century A.D. Do you know that chapter comes to a close with the 2 beasts of chapter 13, the sea beast and the land beast, being cast into the sulfurous lake of fire. There is the outcome then of those particular enemies that persecuted God's people in the immediate issue of emperor worship. That brings us to chapter 20. What good does it do to bring into account and judgment the henchman of Satan if he is still allowed to continue his old wiles in the context of this book? And so chapter 20 describes for us how Satan is judged, how he is handled. Some people would say, well, this is end of time, when Satan will be ultimately and finally judged. I think not. I think it's referring to Satan's specific ability to deceive the nations. That's the terminology of Revelation, to deceive the nations into worshiping the emperor. He is bound and stopped from doing that. That doesn't mean that Satan is not free to operate in other ways over other issues, but he was prevented at that point. And then as you proceed through the chapter, we're shown the ultimate outcome of Satan. He too is cast into the sulfurous lake of fire where the 2 beasts of chapter 13 were cast. And the last part of the chapter describes this ultimate judgment scene in which all who are wicked will be consigned to the same location which is described as the second death, that is eternal death. The loss of one's salvation or the loss of being permitted to be with God eternally, that's the second death, hell, being cast into the sulfurous lake of fire. That brings us then to chapter 21. Beginning in chapter 21:1 and extending into chapter 22, verse 5, we have 3 distinct portraits that depict for us what will be the ultimate outcome of the redeemed. As they go through this terrible suffering and persecution in first century Rome and endure those atrocities, they wanted to know what relief is available to us immediately. We need immediate assistance. And certainly the book provides that. But then just momentarily, the Lord pulls back the curtain and lets us see what's the ultimate outcome of any suffering, affliction, oppression, persecution that any Christian might go through. Those people then, we today. And the answer is that we are going to get to be in the very presence of God. And I believe there are 3 portraits that depict this for us. Highly figurative language, highly symbolic, not literal. One is, we are said to tabernacle with God. That's chapter 21, the first 8 verses. We get to dwell with God. So perfect fellowship, being right in the very presence of God. That's what Christians can enjoy in prospect now by simply being Christians, by being members of Christ's church. But then we can look forward to that eternal presence of God, actually being in His presence. The second portrait, which begins, I suppose, in verse 9 of chapter 21 and extends to the end of that chapter, we see this great city. It is situated on 12 foundations made out of the most precious substances known to human beings. There are 3 gates on each of the 4 walls. Each one of the gates consists of an entire massive pearl. Notice the dimensions of this city. It is the same length as it is height and depth or width. It's the same. In other words, it forms a perfect cube. Do you know in the Old Testament when God at Mount Sinai gave the Israelites instructions concerning the construction of the portable worship site, the tabernacle, which was then later put into permanent form in Solomon's day, 1 Kings chapter 9, where the temple was built and inaugurated. Both the portable mobile tent and the permanent temple in Jerusalem had within it the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, where no human being was ever allowed to go except the high priest. And he was only allowed to go in there once a year on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, to offer sacrifice for the sins of the nation and for himself. And this, under the Old Testament economy, symbolized and foreshadowed the presence of God, the forgiveness of God, the atonement available through God and through Christ. Do you know that the dimensions of the most holy place was a perfect cube? So here we have the city of God in highly apocalyptic language represented to these downtrodden Christians as a place where God's presence will be. What kind of light will be necessary? Well, no electric lamps or anything like that. The text says God and Christ the Lamb will be all the light that's needed. There is no, you've sung these songs, there is no night there, no more sorrow, no more death, no more tears, no more sickness, pain, suffering. It's going to be a wonderful place. You know, some of the songs that we've sing talk about the paved streets of gold. They get that from this passage. However, it is not streets, plural. It is street. There is a street of gold. But we must keep in mind that all of that imagery is highly figurative. We can't expect to see literal gold in heaven. It will be a spiritual realm. Remember, 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of the kingdom of heaven not inheriting flesh and blood. So it's not a physical realm of matter like our realm is. Jesus said, "A spirit hath not flesh and blood as you see me have." We will be clothed with immortal bodies according to 1 Corinthians 15, but we will not be material or physical or composed of matter like this universe is. So it's difficult for humans to comprehend. No doubt that's one of the major reasons why when God refers to the eternal realm, He uses imagery and figures of speech to convey the ideas, knowing that we finite beings cannot truly grasp or conceptualize an infinite realm. The third portrait in chapter 22, 1 through 5, that shows us this outcome of the redeemed. Now the imagery shifts to garden language. And this imagery has the saved reinstated to the lambs, or to the tree of life. You know, the tree of life was depicted way back in Genesis chapter 3. 2 and 3, where Adam and Eve were put in the Garden of Eden. They had access to the tree of life. But then whenever they sinned, they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, cherubim placed there where they could never return, so access to the tree of life was cut off, denied. But notice here in chapter 22, where the eternal realm, the ultimate state of the redeemed, where they get relief from all of the difficulties and hardships of life, is depicted in garden language where a crystal river flows from the throne of God, and situated on the banks of that crystal river is the tree of life. It produces fruit 12 months out of the year. Its leaves have healing power. Well, again, there's not going to be a literal tree with literal fruit that we would consume. It's very symbolic, apocalyptic language, but you get the point. You get the point that not only is this realm a place of perfect fellowship, we dwell with God, a place of perfect protection, a city foursquare, it is a place of perfect provision. God will see to all of our needs. He'll care for us. We will be sustained. We will derive our sustenance from God Himself and from Jesus Christ at His side. What a wonderful way to bring this book to its climax and its close, to reassure Christians of the ultimate outcome of any physical, earthly, historical struggle that we may encounter. That brings us then to the rest of the book, which is verses 6 to the end of chapter 22, which is verse 21. And here is the epilogue of the book. Here's just the closing remarks, the final comments, summary statements. You know, we looked at this chapter in our first program, second program, where we talked about verse 6 and verse 10 that tells us this had to do with events that were then occurring. And notice also at the end of this chapter we get an invitation. Look at chapter 22 where we are informed, the Spirit and the bride say, "Come. Whoever wishes to drink of the water of life freely may do so." That's chapter 22, verse 17. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come." It's an invitation. You know, not only is this an invitation that closes out the book of Revelation, it's an invitation that closes out the whole Bible. God and Christ and the Spirit inviting people to come, to become Christians, to live the Christian life. Wonderful invitation. But notice verses 18 and 19 bring us closer to the end of the book with a warning. Here we are informed that anyone who adds to God's words or takes away from God's words will experience terrible judgment. You'll have plagues added to you. You'll have your name taken out of the book of life. So we must heed those words, not only for the book of Revelation, but for all of God's words, not add to or take away from them, as Moses said in Deuteronomy 4:2, or Solomon said in Proverbs 30 and verse 6. And then the book closes with its closing benediction or prayer, in which there is a plea that the Lord might come quickly. And I believe that Jesus coming quickly in that verse and in verse 7 is not talking about the end of time, but Jesus coming quickly to fulfill the words of this book, which had to do with the terrible persecutions that Christians were enduring during that first century Holocaust of Roman persecution implemented against the cause of Christ and His people. So, here we've looked at the 22 chapters, the action of these chapters, and how they describe specific historical circumstances that Christians were then facing, and that is worship of Caesar. Christians were demands were placed upon Christians to worship the emperor, and those who refused, if not outright killed, were banished. You know, when John received this revelation, according to chapter 1, he was on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, right off the coast of Asia Minor, where political enemies of the state were banned to the marble quarries and to incarceration there. So they're facing an actual historical situation. That's the essence of the book. We now lack one program in which we discuss the meaning of this book, its proper application. But first this song, and then I'll be back in just a moment.
On Zion's glorious summit has stood the numerous hosts redeemed by blood. They hymn their King in strains divine. I heard the song and strove to join. I heard the song and strove to join. He
Thank you for staying tuned to our program. This series, entitled The Book of Revelation for Today, is available to you in the form of audio cassette tapes. We will send these to you if you care to write us this week at The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Request the series, The Book of Revelation for Today, and we'll send that to you with no cost and no obligation. On a future program, we're going to go to the heart of the book of Revelation. We've looked at introductory material, we've looked at the basic action of the book. Now we want to go and say, now what's the central message here? Let's not get so bogged down in the details that we don't see its proper application. I hope you'll watch on our next program when we'll examine those matters. May God bless you.
Now the full revelation has been given to man. Let us strive for the kingdom by God's clear plan. We must never be swayed by the doctrines of men. Speak the truth in love and grow up unto Him. Following God, following God, following God, following God, following God. Speaking the truth, speaking the truth, speaking the truth.